Finally, we turn to Professor Zhang Longxi of the City University of Hong Kong. Professor Zhang holds a master's in English from Peking University and a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. He also, I believe, was a Harvard Yenjing doctoral scholar while he was studying here at Harvard. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of World Literature, and he's written widely in both Chinese and English. His major English books include The Tao and the Logos, Literary Hermeneutics, East and West, and most recently, a book entitled From Comparison to World Literature. Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Professor Perry, for the introduction. Given the very limited time, I just want to make very short remarks, and maybe we can have some time for discussion. I just want to say about three things, because Asian studies, traditionally, I think Asian studies is really outsider looking at Asia from the outside. Includes sinology, Japanology, Koreanology, and so on, or Indology. So it's not really Asian scholars studying their own tradition, but rather particularly European and American scholars study Asia. So in that sense, Asian studies, by writing, actually, if you look at the Journal of Asian Studies, is published in English, or many of the important journals in Asian studies or Oriental studies using English or French as the language of publication. So in that sense, Asian studies by nature is looking from outside into Asia. But of course, just like Professor Hirano just mentioned earlier, now there are so much border crossing. There are so many Asian scholars also come to the West and study and also contribute to Asian studies. So nowadays, it's very difficult to say it's completely outsider looking at the in or insider looking from outside. So as a comparativist myself, I always think that I cannot really claim to be an insider or outsider. But that's what I enjoy, actually. In between this is precisely where the comparatives should be. So Asian studies, because of this origin in the West, and there is a tradition, basically, I think, of looking at Asia from outside and therefore emphasize the difference between Asia and Europe. I mean, the emphasis on difference, the cultural difference between different civilizations is indeed the major trend or predominant tendency in Asian studies. I remember in 1991, the Journal of Asian Studies was the editor, what's his name, Baker. He had a special issue, a forum on universalism and relativism. Basically, universalism is a view that different civilizations share certain commonality and it's universal. But relativist view is really questioning whether there is any conceptual tools available to study different civilizations across regions and across borders and so on. And he said the related view, the skeptic view of this commonality and possibility of studying Asia using a conceptual tool that is interculturally, intersubjectively valid is very much in doubt. And that is the predominant view by among most Asian scholars. And said, indeed, in the Journal of Asian Studies, most of the papers published are emphasizing on the East-West divide. If you look at the traditional sinology, certainly in 19th century, in France in particular, Jonathan Spence, once he said there is a French tendency of what he called the French exotic. That is, French scholars in particular look at Asia, always looking at something that is very different and looking at the very attraction of the study of Asia is because it is exotic. And of course, this has an intellectual tradition. If you think of Lévi-Brouss's idea of mentalite, every nation, every culture has a different mentality and embedded in a different language. and you find sinologists very important. Marcel Granet wrote this book called Pensée chinoise, basically using the same idea to discuss Chinese culture and Chinese thinking. And in 20th century, Jacques Genet, his book on Christianity in China, why Christianity failed in China, because Chinese couldn't possibly understand what Christianity is, because the Chinese didn't really have abstract thinking, couldn't really understood what is the spiritual truth of Christianity. All this, and trying to talk on a level of language and philosophy, and always push to this fundamental difference and incommensurability. And if you look at the 20th century, very important social science and humanities influential concepts. Of course, Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm as incommensurate is very, very influential in social studies and humanities. So that is the basic problem. I think Asian studies, if you think of Asian studies is really study of Asia, largely in writing in English or French or other European languages, it's really by nature comparative. This is part of my argument in my keynote speech this year in Toronto, because writing about Asia in a Western language is by nature comparative. But I do not believe that writing in English or French would make you become an English thinker or French thinker. I mean, I don't believe the Sapir-Whorf thesis that the language you speak will determine what you think, by the sheer fact that the speakers of the same language have very different views. You know, you all speak English, but in America you have different schools, different scholars, very different schools. The same is true of Chinese speakers. Sometimes I find myself agree with some foreign scholars more than with fellow Chinese scholars. And so the difference is everywhere. It's not just between languages and cultures, but also among languages and cultures. So you find diversity and difference everywhere, not just across the geographical or linguistic or ethnic boundaries. So I think the important concept, again, Professor Hirano just mentioned the border crossing. It's very important. I mean, Asian studies, if you think of this East-West divide, nowadays in particular, there is a tendency, I also argue that Asian studies is not just a pure sort of academic discipline study. It is scholarship, but at the same time it's always related to the world we live in, which also in many important ways define how we do our scholarship. And I think for Asian studies, I think with the change of the world, in particularly the last few decades in the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, I would say now we have a much better condition to do Asian studies, because Asia becomes more and more important. The rise of China and India in economic and political power, and certainly that is making the world pay more attention to Asia. Asia didn't matter when, in 30 years ago or 50 years ago in the West. Can look at Asia, for example, nobody would read a Chinese scholar's book to learn China. To learn about China. And what you need in Asian studies is to read other sinologists rather than read any native scholarship. But nowadays, I think it's very important to have the really break up this boundary between the insider and outsider, as I mentioned earlier. I don't know whether I consider myself as insider or outsider, because I got my PhD at Harvard. I taught in California for 10 years, and I'm now in Hong Kong in 20 years. But I originate from China. I study Chinese classics by myself, and I read in Chinese classics. So whether I consider myself an insider China or outsider. So I think this is a silly question. Actually, we should not consider this. Border crossing is important. What is good scholarship is good scholarship. It doesn't matter whether it's written in English or Chinese or whatever language. So I think that's one thing I want to emphasize, particularly in the world we are now living in. I think we should not emphasize the East-West divide. We should build bridges rather than walls. People are talking about building walls along the borders. I think that's silly. It's not realistic, and also intellectually it doesn't make sense. I mean, Asian studies or any scholarship is precisely about breaking down the walls. China has a Great Wall, but it didn't prevent the Mongols came from the north and conquered China. And the war, of course, many people question whether Marco Polo did go to China. There's a famous book by Frances Wood. Her implied answer is no, because the book didn't talk about Great War. But the Great War today we see is built by Ming Dynasty. In the Ming Dynasty, 300 years after Marco Polo. So I think wars never worked, physically or metaphorically. I think therefore it's more important today to emphasize the bridging, the crossing of borders and making bonds with other people, other civilizations, rather than to retreat from in a sort of populism, nationalism. I think that's a very dangerous tendency. This is the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that actually in China, I believe this is true of Japan and Korea, the best scholars of their own traditions realize that nowadays, particularly 21st century, you cannot just study your own civilization in isolation. You have to study the civilization at least in a region in East Asia. For example, in Taiwan University, a group of people have, particularly led by Professor Huang Junjie in Taiwan University, has this study of Confucianism in the East Asian framework, rather than just traditionally look at the commentators in China. But now they also look at Japanese commentators, Korean commentators, and all this study of Confucianism. I had a very different view and very interesting insights getting from a different perspective. In Fudan University, Guo Zhaoguang, a very good Chinese scholar, also proposed to study China from the border regions, to look at China, again, not just within China, but also from Japanese and Korean and Vietnamese perspectives. And because there are many material available, traditionally Chinese scholars would only read Chinese scholars. But now I think important is to look at this in a larger perspective. And again, it's emphasizing the comparative methodology. I think nowadays the best scholar, what is the best scholar? A best scholar is a scholar who knows his or her own field so well. He also knows the limitations, and therefore to push boundary to beyond that boundary is the way to go for newer insights in scholarship. Therefore, I think even for the study of traditional Chinese or traditional Korean or Japanese cultures has reached to the point that a bigger region, enlarged horizon, a different, more broad, broader perspective is important, methodologically important concept to push for. The third point I want to talk about very briefly is what has already been mentioned, Asian studies or study of their traditions in China in particular. For example, Guoxue, the national learning. National learning has been controversial for many years because it's not very well defined. And not just the definition of this concept, but really the purpose of doing Guoxue. Nowadays, I think in China, maybe it's very healthy. It's very different. Many different people, different scholars have different views on any issue. There's debates and different critical perspective. I think that's very healthy, maybe. And about the study of tradition, study of Chinese tradition, or Guoxue, national learning, sometimes it's simplified to Confucianism and a certain way of looking at Confucianism. It's really, if you look at Confucianism, if you read 论语, for example, the Confucian Analects, what the people are talking about in Guoxue is very different from what traditionally understood of original Confucian thinking, or even the different tradition. Of course, Confucianism has been a very complicated phenomenon in China because it has long tradition. But Chinese civilization is not just Confucianism. Traditionally, we recall three teachings. It's also Taoism and Buddhism are also very important. But Guoxue tend to be heavily on the Confucian side. So that's a limitation. And another more serious limitation, I think, is this narrow-minded nationalistic tendency in the study of national tradition. It's really for not just the soft power, It's really a boost of national pride. I think that is not very helpful. this kind of tendency is also existent. And in recent time, you can think some people have talked about Confucianism almost turning it into a national religion. I don't think that it will be ever be successful. China's, if there's anything that is really different from China from the West, is that China never has a religion, or never has religion as the priority on top of priorities. But some people were trying to push for Confucianism almost as a religion or a predominant ideology. I think that is a very dangerous, unhelpful tendency. So there is also this complication of the study of tradition. Of course, it's understandable. China is now getting more and more developed, and economically and politically, and therefore culturally also is important. So it's important to have this, to understand the rise of Guoxue, but at the same time, there's both positive side and negative side. The positive side is that some scholars really have done very good studies of Zhuxi, for example, Song Dynasty, Confucian, and much more scholarship indeed in the study of traditional culture. But on the other hand, there is this very difficult to differentiate, but we have to make the differentiation between the purely scholarly research and for the understanding of tradition and the sort of nationalistic usage of Guoxue or national learning as a tool to sort of boost national pride, and that is a not very good tendency. So finally, let me just conclude the 3 points I've mentioned. That is, I think it's very, very important for Asian studies, not just Western view of China or Japan or Korea or Asia in general, nor should be the differentiation of the scholarship as Asian studies as a Western discipline and a native scholarship in China and Japan, Korea. So I think now it's really the time to break up this kind of dichotomy. And actually, once I used Su Longpo's famous poem on Lu San to argue that, Lu San is a very famous poem. The first line says that if Lu San, if you look from the side or from far or from near, they're all different views. But of course, the 2 last lines are most famous. We don't know the true face of Mount Lu because we're all inside. It seems to imply that if you get outside, you can have the view. This is not what Su Longpo is saying, because in the first 2 lines, he already says, Lu San is different from a different point of view. So I think there's no, insider's view is better or outsider's view is better, but to understand Asia in general should be the integration of different scholarship from both the outside and the inside. So finally, I would say, crossing the borders and really abolish all these different artificial differentiations, boundaries is a way for Asian studies to develop in the future. Thank you.